Today I want to discuss EF Dawah's Open Forum episode 110. This is not a reaction video where I declare winners and losers. Instead, I want to focus on one argument that appeared throughout the discussion and explain why, from my perspective as an atheist, it creates a serious problem for Islam itself. The central theme of the episode was familiar. The hosts argued that the Bible has not been preserved. They discussed textual changes, doctrinal development, disputes over the Trinity, and the idea that previous revelations were altered by human beings. Their conclusion was that God ultimately sent the Qur'an to restore the original message. At first glance, that sounds like a powerful argument. If earlier scriptures were corrupted, then perhaps a final revelation was needed. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt that this explanation creates problems that are at least as serious as the problems it is trying to solve. The first issue is dependence. Islam spends a great deal of time criticizing earlier Abrahamic traditions, yet Islam also inherits most of its worldview from those same traditions. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Joseph, David, Solomon, Satan, angels, paradise, judgment day, and Jesus all arrive within a religious landscape that already existed before Islam. From a secular historical perspective, Islam looks less like a completely new revelation and more like the latest chapter in an ongoing Abrahamic tradition. That raises an obvious question. If the earlier traditions are so unreliable, how confident should we be about the stories that Islam inherits from them? Muslims often argue that the original revelations contained truth, but were later corrupted. My question is simple. How do we know which parts were true and which parts were corrupt? How do we know Abraham existed as described? How do we know Moses existed as described? How do we know which elements of earlier traditions were authentic revelations and which were later inventions? The answer usually comes back to the Qur'an. The Qur'an confirms some things and rejects others, but that creates a circular problem. The Qur'an is being used to validate its own understanding of earlier history. For someone who is not already convinced that the Qur'an is divine, that doesn't really solve the problem. It simply relocates it. The second issue is even more significant. Why does God's communication strategy seem to fail so often? Think about the story Islam asks us to accept. God reveals guidance, human beings corrupted, people are misled, centuries pass. God sends another revelation, human beings corrupt that too. More people are misled, more centuries pass. God sends another revelation, the cycle repeats itself again and again. Eventually we arrive at the Qur'an. At this point, Muslims tell us that God has finally preserved the message. But from the outside, that pattern looks strange. If God repeatedly allowed revelation to become corrupted, why should we assume the final stage is different? And why stop communicating altogether? According to Islam, humanity repeatedly distorted divine guidance. Yet after Muhammad, the revelation stops. No new prophets, no new scriptures, no new miracles, nothing. Humanity continues arguing, dividing into sects, founding new religions, abandoning old religions, and disagreeing about fundamental questions. Yet God's answer appears to be a book revealed 14 centuries ago. This is where the EF Dawah argument begins to work against itself. The host repeatedly asked why God would allow previous scriptures to be corrupted. I think that's a fair question, but once you ask that question, it doesn't stop with Christianity. It turns around and faces Islam as well. Why did God allow corruption in the first place? Why was revelation repeatedly vulnerable? Why were generations left with disputed teachings? And why should we believe the cycle suddenly ended in the 7th century? For me, these questions are more important than manuscript debates. Even if one granted every criticism of the Bible, the larger issue would remain. Islam still has to explain why an all-knowing and all-powerful God chose such an indirect and apparently unreliable method of communicating with humanity. My overall takeaway from this episode is therefore somewhat different from the host's conclusion. I don't think the discussion weakened Christianity as much as they intended. Instead, I think it highlighted a deeper tension within Islam itself. The more Islam emphasizes corruption, alteration, and failure in previous revelations, the more difficult it becomes to explain why the entire process should inspire confidence in the final revelation. For me, the problems identified in the episode are real. I simply don't think Islam solves them. It moves them one step further back. And that is why, after listening to this discussion, I came away not with greater confidence in Islam's explanation of Christianity, but with greater skepticism towards the entire story of repeated revelation, corruption, and correction.